It's now time for me to introduce our next speaker. Chris Rickert is a veteran reporter, editor, and columnist for the Wisconsin State Journal. Chris's presentation will hit the high points of news as it was before the advent of cable and the internet, then delve into how news consumers can know if what they are reading, seeing, and hearing in the age of social media is true. At the end of this presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, just like a reporter. Again, please use the Q&A box. Welcome, Chris. The floor is yours.
Hopefully everybody sees the New York Times page. Okay. All right, so I thought to start, it'd probably be good to go through a very quick and dirty history of American journalism, because I think it's instructive for where we are now. So as some of you might not know, newspaper journalism, which was really the only kind of journalism, 150 years ago, wasn't really what you'd see today. It was partisan. Papers were purchased by politicians or people who were close to politicians, and they had definite viewpoints, and they made that clear not just in their opinions or columns, but also in their news pages. There were papers that were for the Democratic Party, papers that were for the Whig Party, and so on. The idea of a quote-unquote objective news media really didn't start to take root in the United States until around the turn of the century, the early 1900s. That's when you started to see professionalism in journalism and schools of journalism opening, and people starting to think about journalism as something that should tell the truth without fear or favor to its readers. So in those kinds of lines, you have this, what we call the MSM, or the mainstream media in newspapers. That's obviously the Times and lots of other newspapers. Here's my own employer. I just wanted to point out that for you newsprint lovers, you can actually read a copy of the printed paper online. You don't have to deal with all the pop-up ads and all that. So we have kind of the old line mainstream newspapers. We have wire services like the Associated Press. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with that. Reuters is another one. They focus a lot on international news. And then and then of course with the advent of radio, you got your radio newscasts on radio. You obviously have TV. Let's see, I'm trying to go back to a different screen here. Okay. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, you had the advent of public media. So here in Wisconsin, we got PBS Wisconsin. Here's another local TV news station, the Channel 3000, maybe the most popular of the local ones. Let's see, okay. All right. So after the advent of TV and radio, which, as you might imagine at the time, everybody was predicting kind of the death of newspapers around that time, kind of as how they're predicting or have been predicting the death of newspapers since the advent of the internet. It didn't happen then. It hasn't happened yet today. But after the advent of electronic media, TV and radio, you have something called the Fairness Doctrine. I'm not sure if other people have heard of this, but this was a policy enacted federally in the United States, kind of with the advent of TV and radio becoming more common. And the idea was that because television and radio signals, the airwaves, are public property, and the government sells what are essentially leases or charges radio stations and TV rent to use those airwaves, that they should have a broader mission than just to put on programming and to make money through ads. And that broader mission was to provide kind of an all points of view type of approach with their news coverage. So this was known as the Fairness Doctrine, and it required radio stations and TV stations to provide a chance for all sides, or to get their point across. It required that they allow people who disagree with some of the editorial content. You had to give them a forum on that station to do that. And so it was in place for nearly 40 years until the Reagan administration, when it was dropped. And this is pivotal kind of in the news world, because it was then that a lot of the news talk radio kind of became very popular. Historians of media will tell you it was the end of the Fairness Doctrine that led to the rise of Rush Limbaugh in the 90s, which led to the Republican takeover of Congress in the 90s, and to kind of a very partisan political atmosphere we have now. All right. So, but just before the Fairness Doctrine was dumped, cable came along. CNN was founded in 1980, and the good thing about 24/7 cable news is that you get to have news 24/7. That's also the bad thing about cable news, because when you have that much time to fill with content, quality of content can suffer. So CNN came along, they were kind of the standard bearer, and now as the cable industry has matured, you have stations that are geared towards certain audiences. You have MSNBC on the left, you have Fox News, of course, on the right, and they've just kind of proliferated from there. I have a streaming service at home. I don't have cable, and I have, I don't know, dozens of news channels from various places. One is this Newsy, which seems to be pretty down the line, middle, fair type of thing. But then there's Newsmax. You might have heard of Newsmax. This is one of three kind of pro-Trump, even more uber Fox News than Fox News is. But you also have these on the left. Now This News is one of them, but there are others out there. So cable news was another big pivotal moment in the whole media landscape. All right, so moving on with all of this, and with troubles that the newspaper industry had, and radio television had as well, keeping advertisers when you have an internet where that allows just an infinite number of possibilities to put your ad on. People in the news business, people who wanted to do good quality, objective news coverage, are going towards this nonprofit model. So of all of those nonprofit models, ProPublica might be the most well-known. They did win a Pulitzer Prize recently. They're very well respected nationally and internationally. In Wisconsin, there are also a few of these. Wisconsin Watch, the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, is one of those. They're based at UW-Madison. It's actually run by a couple of my former colleagues at the State Journal. And then you have some other local news nonprofits. Madison 365 is one in Madison that's gained some traction of late. Their audience is really communities of color. But again, they are nonprofit. They rely on donations from individuals, foundations, etc. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum is McIver News Institute, which you might have heard of. They are a foundation-supported news outlet, I guess, that is pretty well associated with the conservative side of the political spectrum with state Republicans. Similar to them is an outfit called the Center Square, which is also tends to lean right and has outlets not just in Wisconsin, but in other places around the country. Let's see, okay. And then kind of similar to Center Square is a new, relatively new outfit that was launched, I believe, in late 2019 called Courier Newsroom. And they do have their own Wisconsin site. It's called Up North News. I'm not seeing it on here initially, but that's because my screen here is in the way. But if you've heard of Up North News, they're an online news site. They market themselves as covering state government, state and local issues. The thing to, all right. The thing to keep in mind with nonprofit news sites is that for a long time in mainstream journalism, there's been a pretty well-constructed wall between advertisers' wishes and the news coverage. So newspaper people like to say there is an actual wall between the ad department and the editorial department, and advertisers do not influence news coverage. And for as long as I've been in newspapers, I have found that to be true. I think any newspaper of any size, you will find that to be the case. That is often one of the criticisms of media, is that they do what advertisers say they do. I can't speak to other places, but that's not been my experience. So, but the question with newer nonprofit foundation and donor supported sites is what the relationship is between their donors and their editors and reporters, and whether their donors affect their news coverage. My advice has always been that you look at who pays for the news. In the case of old line mainstream media, it's pretty easy to find out who pays for that news coverage. All you have to do is look at the ads. Nonprofit websites are a little bit different in how they do this. ProPublica does say who their funders are, although if you try to look up their funders through their IRS tax forms, which are known as 990s, these are tax forms that nonprofits file that say who is funding them. You'll find that they don't disclose their funders on that, which always makes me a little suspicious, but there you have it. All right, so into all this, you suddenly throw the popularity of social media, and social media has been accused for a long time of trying to kill mainstream newspapers, along with other forces in the world like TV and radio. It appears that they're starting to have some impact. As you probably know, social media like Facebook and Twitter have algorithms that essentially track what you do online and then put in your news feed the type of content that they think you would like based on the information they've gathered about you while you're using your computer. The problem with that is it often doesn't put in front of you content that we might need to know or that might be the most helpful to our lives. It often puts content in front of you that you might call clickbait, or stuff that kind of gets you emotionally worked up. And once you get emotionally worked up over it and start commenting on it and sharing and whatnot, it creates kind of a loop where that will continue to be the kinds of things that show up on your newsfeed. And this, if you talk to some commenters, is kind of what's ruining American democracy. All right, so moving forward, so all of this has kind of contributed to problems in the newspaper industry, especially when it comes to local news. This is a Pew Charitable Trust's report talking about circulation of daily newspapers. As you can see, it peaked in around the late 90s. Has been dropping since. Newspaper website visits have gone up, which is good. The issue with how to financially sustain newspapers with online advertising is that online advertising brings in much less revenue than the advertising in the newspaper. You see another graphic about how much time people are spending on newspaper sites. It used to be you sit there and read a story for nearly 3 minutes. It's gone down to less than 2 minutes now. You know, I suppose we're all having a little bit shorter attention spans. Okay. All right. There's been studies and coverage in recent years about what this means for you know, our democracy and our communities. The decline of local newspapers, local news and communities has been linked with all sorts of disturbing outcomes, more partisanship, you know, corruption in local government, just local government that doesn't meet the needs of its people as well as it used to. And you can kind of figure this out yourself as to why that might be. Local news obviously focuses on local issues, and local issues tend not to be ones that are easily painted into one partisan corner or another. Republicans, Democrats, whatever your politics are, you want your garbage picked up on time. You know, you want your children to come out of school being able to read. So coverage of that kind of stuff really is kind of nonpartisan, but essential to people's lives in a lot of ways. All right, now let's start moving on to a little bit of the bias issue, and then I'll hope I can answer some questions. There are two things whenever I look at a newspaper or news site or cable site or whatever that I try to figure out first when it comes to whether I will believe the information that they're giving me. I think typically you can be pretty certain that if, you know, the Times or the State Journal or the Associated Press, if you know them in real life to have been reliable, you can pretty much expect that what you see on their online sites is going to be reliable as well. But if you don't know the sites that you're coming to, I look for a couple things. One is how transparent they are about their funding sources. Yeah, well, that was the two things. How transparent they are and what their funding sources are. Okay, so, but when you are talking about news sites, national news sites that we all know, even some international ones, if you want to try to get a sense for where they're coming from and not just on their editorial page, because it is mostly true that mainstream media, they do have biases, and even in their news pages, just because, you know, reporters are human and humans are not perfect, and objectivity is kind of more of a perfect state that one is always striving towards than necessarily one always is able to attain. So I found this chart that's up on the screen now to be, it seems reliable to me. The person who's put it out there seems like a straight shooter, and they break down major news sources. Well, not all of them are major, but news sources by how reliable are and how much they swing one way or the other to the left or the right. And so, as you can see here, you have most of the mainstream news sources kind of tend to skew a little bit left in the news coverage. You know, there are exceptions. If you look to the right there, you see the Wall Street Journal, you see Fox. Interestingly, this analysis tends to rate the ones that are towards the left a little bit more reliable. So in other words, it's not that they get their facts correct more often than not, but you know, you can have all of your facts correct and still have a perspective or a way of framing those facts that swings one way or the other on the political spectrum. So anyways, I found this pretty helpful and instructive. Okay, moving on. The current kind of insider fight going on in mainstream journalism now is this fight over whether objectivity can even exist, and whether what we've always thought of as objectivity in in the news business isn't just a nice way of saying what upper middle class or middle class white people think is accurate. The 1619 Project is kind of at the center of this dispute. It won a Pulitzer Prize. It's becoming a curriculum that will be taught in schools. Republicans have raised questions about this because the author and kind of the brainchild of the 1619 Project has been upfront about her view of journalism as being not about trying to achieve some kind of false objectivity. She would consider it false objectivity, but about having a more activist or social justice mission. You might have heard about her in the dispute that she was involved in going back to her alma mater, which is the University of North Carolina. She was offered a tenured position there as a professor of journalism, and a major funder, and I believe that maybe the one of the trustees or something with the university who was a journalist fought back against this because he still kind of holds on to the idea that newspapers should strive for an objectivity that does, not assume certain things are correct and have a particular, view about the world. So there, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, there are lots of interesting things you can read about this whole dispute within journalism. Last year, the opinion page editor of the New York Times was dismissed because he put on allowed to be published on the editorial page a column by Tom Cotton, who's a Republican senator, and the reporters at the Times were up in arms about this, feeling like this is not the kind of view that should be given any credence, that it was wrong, and that even to have that view was, a disservice to the Times and a disservice to its readers. And it doesn't take much to go from those types of fights to the whole type of fight about cancel culture and so on. So here's kind of my spiel on where that leaves us today in terms of knowing what is real news, what is fake news, and how we decide what kinds of news are better for us and the types of things that we should know. With the decline in local news coverage, you've seen kind of a nationalization of news. So, and I see this in Madison regularly, where people who are very tuned in to what's going on the national political scene attempt to kind of apply those lessons to what's going on in Madison. Madison, as everybody knows, is a very liberal place politically, but that doesn't mean that if something happens in Madison that is seen as a right-wing effort or a conservative effort, people often kind of connect that effort or that happening to this larger national narrative. One example of late in the last couple of years is the issue of police officers in schools. There probably is quite a good argument to be made that there shouldn't be police officers in schools, and that they do lead to what's called this school to prison pipeline. But that is kind of an overall narrative. Within Madison, if you look carefully at what's happened here, it's kind of a harder case to make. All of the officers that had been in the main Madison high schools were people of color, and it was kind of difficult to make that case. But it's kind of an example of what you see of these national narratives becoming localized, largely because people just aren't paying as much attention to what's going on locally. Kind of on the other side of the spectrum, as I'm sure lots of you have seen, there are these local school boards where you're getting people who are coming in and complaining about mask mandates and COVID vaccine requirements. And I haven't been in these communities, I live in Madison, but my sense there is that these are people who are kind of listening to a national conservative narrative about what masks and vaccines mean and trying to apply that to very specific local case. School board members, in my experience, do make an effort to know what's going on in their schools. And if they believe that certain public health measures are necessary, usually they're basing that on actual facts and what's happening within that district. Okay. So I guess kind of what I'd say in conclusion is that for me, it's important for news consumers to think about the types of news that would most help them in their lives. And so, it's interesting and it's entertaining, for example, to read about AOC and the squad or Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Trump person in Congress, and we can kind of get all worked up about that and tweet about it and argue on Facebook about it, as Facebook is kind of filling our feeds with these kinds of stories. But in the end, the question is, what that kind of news does in helping you to live your own life and understanding your world and understanding the community around you. AOC has been rated one of the least effective legislators in Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't even on any committees in Congress because of some of her views. So, their impact on us on a day-to-day basis is just very small. Whereas the impact of, say, the local school board on what happens to us, even if we don't have children, is arguably much, much bigger. Even if you don't have children that go to schools, you pay taxes to the school district. Typically, taxes to the school district are the largest share of your property tax bill. Okay, so that's kind of my spiel on news. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chris. We do have some questions that came in, and I do encourage you to use the Q&A box. We will take questions up until 12 noon today. I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, so feel free to submit your questions. The first question what we had come in was asking you to expand about advocacy reporting. The New York Times mentions that younger reporters feel compelled to take a position, especially on social justice. Can you talk about that?
I agree with that. I tend to be an old person in local news, and because of the way newspaper finances have gone recently, there have been a lot of buyouts. A lot of that institutional knowledge from older reporters has gone, and you have a lot of young reporters doing the job, which isn't to say that they don't know what they're doing or that you can't rely on what they report. But I have certainly noticed within the younger generation of news reporters that they've been taught that their job is not, getting both sides or all sides, but that they're kind of, that they are to be advocates, they are to right wrongs, so on and so forth. That's all great. The question is who decides, what are wrongs and what is the right way to fix them. And I think that mostly goes back to our universities. It's not any secret that humanities in journalism schools, just, their faculty tend to lean left. And so you're kind of going to see that for people coming out of J school.
The next question that came in is asking you to expand on cancel culture.
I don't know that I'd really be qualified to talk about that. People will tell you it is a thing. People will tell you it's not a thing. It touches on so many parts of our culture and so many kind of deep questions about the kinds of people we are and the kinds of people we want to be. Certainly in social media, and I've been subjected to this somewhat, having been an opinion columnist. You will get people that try to shout you down or whatever on social media, but at the same time, it's not as if anybody, canceled or not, has a paucity of ways to get their view out. The only people, I guess, that you could argue were canceled in some way would be like the Trumps when they're taken off Twitter or whatever. But at the same time, these are private companies. And just like newspapers don't have to run letters to the editor from anybody, Twitter doesn't have to host people that they don't want to host. And that is a whole other discussion about whether social media has become kind of the new public forum, and whether, if that's true, First Amendment rights and free speech rights should apply to these, what are private companies, and can do what they want. So it's fascinating, but I can't say I have any answer.
I have another question that came in. How do we counteract the localization of the national narrative? Those seem to be the loudest voices and overwhelm the actual narrative regarding issues such as school issues, police, etc.
I don't know. I'm sure that there is fault on the side of the local news gatherers in the way that we've presented information and the work we've done to really engage the community. Journalists can always do more of that. And, you know, I'm sure that there's some fault on the side of news consumers and human nature and just what they're attracted to and what kind of gets them going and what they want to see. You know, I always say, if you still have a local newspaper, subscribe to it. Even if you don't like the news, the actual paper, you know, digital subscriptions tend to be cheap. You can get the app on your phone, you can get the alerts or not the alerts. I mean, I find those alerts kind of annoying, but you know, in the end, it kind of comes down to people deciding for themselves what they think they need to know to, you know, to be informed and to make good choices.
We have another question. You mentioned both AOC and Green and how they attract coverage despite being the opposite of problem solvers. How can media create coverage of boring people in the middle who actually are good at solving problems?
Boring people in the middle. Yeah, it seems like the only time the boring people in the middle get a lot of coverage is when you're up against a debt limit, right? And Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema are, you know, hold the keys to moving forward. You know, I don't know. You know, I'm interested in coverage of people who aren't strict partisans and swing one way or the other. And I'm sure that news could do more to amplify the views and the stories of those people. You are always up against the pressure, though, to provide what people want, and people don't always want that. You often hear the criticism that newspapers just want to print or any news organization just is, you know, wants to print clickbait or is throwing crime news out there, for example, because it's sensational and you're getting viewers that way. And, you know, there's an argument to be made for that, but in the end, journalists will provide to the best of their ability what people want to know on the one hand and what they think people need to know. So, you know, those boring stories about local government finance and budgets kind of is an example of the latter. Maybe crime coverage that is not particular to some person in the community with much influence. Maybe that's an example of the former. So I don't know if that answered it, but that's my best shot.
Chris, there's another question here. Many times reporters only have a certain amount of time to turn their stories. Does that time limit compromise the amount of truthful information that they can get out there to the public?
Oh, sure. Yep. Deadlines can restrict fuller stories. That is true. If we do try to do a good job of following up or continuing to follow stories that happen, and a story that starts out one way could end up looking very different at the end. And that is always a question. Do you go with what you have now, or do you wait a little while and go with what more you might learn later, even if your competitor is going with what you have now? So for example, I'll give you one very stark example. There was a teacher at a middle school who was charged with sexually abusing a child. And it was very disturbing criminal complaint to read, and we reported on it. We printed this person's photo in the paper along with another person who was accused of abusing the same child and was a roommate of this teacher. And we followed the court case, and the end of the court case was that the prosecution decided it didn't have a case. It could not believe the child who had lodged claims in this case, and all charges were dropped. Well, that's great for the people who are accused, but that doesn't much help them after their names and their faces and all these terrible allegations have been printed in the paper. So that's always a question. And we report on arrests. We say what people are tentatively charged with. We say we follow them through the courts. If in the end they are found innocent of those charges, we report that as well, as we reported the dropping of the charges in this case. But certainly that is always a question in news coverage.
And one last question before we do wrap up. Professionals who rely on the media for accurate, unbiased reporting are greatly harmed by advocacy journalism and the decline in local news. What can we do?
All right, first let me say that I wouldn't say that there isn't a role for advocacy journalism. My view on that is that you should be upfront about it. That if you work for the Progressive, or if you work for Fox, what's another good example? I'm sorry, but maybe American Spectator is maybe one of the more conservative news magazines. I think you should be upfront about that. I think you should let readers know where you stand. And often they do. Our local magazine, The Progressive, it's right there in the title, it's The Progressive. And it's not as if you can't rely on what they say or that it's not true, but you have to understand that they're coming from a particular angle, and there may be parts of a story that they don't necessarily pay attention to. And I'm sorry, can you say the second part of the question again?
What can we do? I can read the whole thing back to you. Professionals who rely on the media for accurate, unbiased reporting are greatly harmed by advocacy journalism and the decline in local news. What can we do?
Okay, so look at those things I mentioned before. Look at who pays for it. Look at how transparent the organization is about who pays for it. Do a little digging of yourself in the about sections of any news website. Who's on their board of directors? What are the bios of the journalists that work there? You can find those things if you go searching for it. They're just not always, immediately available. If you see certain buzzwords on news sites, free market is one that MacGyver uses. That's kind of a tip that this is kind of coming from a certain political perspective. Look for those types of things. For nonprofit news sites, certainly, look at their tax form. It's not hard to find a nonprofit's tax forms. You just Google IRS 990s, and there are multiple sites that come up that will provide you with organization tax forms, and you can find out who funds them, who pays for them, and what they pay for. So that would kind of be my advice. Be an informed consumer of news, especially today. There are certain sites that you can generally think that, they're giving me the straight stuff. The Times, the State Journal, I think, older news sources, the AP, most national television news, I think is fairly reliable. But if you don't immediately recognize the source, if you have questions about the source, do your own research. On the internet, it's not always terribly hard to find.
Thank you, Chris.